Hello viewers, I am Mushahid Hussain from Pakistan with another episode of Global South Voices on behalf of the CGTN, China's global television channel for the entire world. Global South Voices is the debut program of CGTN which presents a different perspective, seeing the world through the lenses of the Global South, the world's majority. In today's episode, we are going to discuss the recently concluded, highly important Third Plenum of the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, which some consider to be at par and as significant as the famous Third Plenum, which was convened in 1978 under the great visionary leader Deng Xiaoping, which transformed China and transformed the world. And to discuss this very important topic, we have a very distinguished and diverse array of guests from all over the world. We have sitting in the studio with us Ambassador Masood Khalid, former ambassador of Pakistan to China. He served there for 6 years and is considered one of the eminent experts on China in Pakistan. And then in Beijing, we'll be joined by an outstanding personality who has been a close participant of major developments in China in the past decades. He is none other than Mr. Victor Gao. He is Vice President of the China Center for Globalization. Joining us from London is Mr. Jack Perry, the chairman of the 48 Group Club, and he and his family have made a tremendous contribution to promoting better understanding of China in the UK for the past decades. And from Africa, we have an eminent expert based in Rwanda, Mbanda Gerald. He is the founder of the Africa-China Review, and he is a leading researcher and publisher on Africa-China relations. My first question will be directed to our friend in Beijing, Mr. Victor Gao, Mr. Victor Gao, how do you see the significance of this Third Plenum? What are your key takeaways from this meeting?
You mentioned the Third Plenum of the 13th Party Congress in 1978. That really brought China out of the ideological box and opened China to the rest of the world and started economic and political reform. And the result of that reform of the past 46 years or so has turned China into the second largest economy if we use official exchange rate and the largest economy if we use purchasing power parity. Therefore, the most recent third platform concluded really emphasized the need of continued reform of all kinds, and it actually set up a time frame to achieve all the new goals for the reform in the coming 5 years, achieving all the goals by 2029. And it also set up the new goals. And many of these goals are very philosophical. For example, the new qualitative productivity, inclusive development of China, and also how to break through innovation and technological breakthroughs to move up the ladder in all ways and achieve inclusive development for the 1.4 billion Chinese people. Now, I would say this would really clarify China's mission, China's challenges and opportunities in the coming years. And the communique of the Third Plenum will definitely be followed up with new guidelines and action plans in the coming weeks and months, so that all these philosophical points outlined in the communique will need to be fleshed out and provide guidelines for the people in China as to how we should push forward with our reform of all kinds and then achieve all the important economic goals set up for the Chinese nation.
Thank you, Mr. Victor Gao. You've said it with a lot of clarity that this historic meeting basically is a roadmap for China's reform, China's development, China's modernization for the next few decades, and there are timelines specified, as you mentioned, 2029, 2035 and 2049. So I think it's a blueprint for future development. Thank you. Moving on to Ambassador Masood Khan, who's sitting with me in the studio here. What do you see from the Islamabad as the significance of this historic third plenum of the Communist Party of China? You lived in Beijing for 6 years, you interacted with Chinese leaders, and you know China better than most Pakistanis. Yes, Ambassador.
If you see China's progress, it is incremental, it is definite, and it has achieved what you described as the transformation of China in the last 40 years and the transformation of the world's economy. This plenum was important. I think the most interesting thing which I found was the emphasis on the word reform, deepening of reforms. And the word reform has been used, I think, countless times in this document. So this shows the clarity, of the Chinese leadership in terms of the future trajectory which China wants to follow, and the timelines which have been given, very clear timelines. By 2035, a high standard socialist market economy. And to pursue that objective, to pursue that target, by 2029, in the next 5 years, all the tasks or reforms which have been outlined today, they will be implemented. So there is great clarity. And another dimension of this statement, which I read, was it is people centric, and it emphasizes a pragmatic, realistic approach. Seek truth from facts and follow a pragmatic approach for deepening reforms. So I think this is a very important emphasis, and people's welfare, a balance between the security and development. That is also a highlight. You have to have social stability as well as ensure your national security. So I think, to my mind, I think Chinese leadership is very clear as to where China has to go, and more importantly, they are also cognizant of the challenges, the complex international environment, as well as the domestic issues, and now they are embarked on a course correction. And I would recall what President Xi Jinping had said, I think it was at the 20th National Congress. He said that China should be prepared for strong headwinds and choppy waters. So this shows that the leadership, Chinese leadership, is fully aware, fully cognizant of what is happening globally, what challenges China faces, and what should be the course correction as well as the policies which should be followed to address those challenges. So this is, I think, very impressive as far as I am concerned.
So basically, I think the ambassador is very right that there is a lot of clarity in the top leadership of the Communist Party of China, headed by General Secretary Xi Jinping. Then on the way forward, it has to be a pragmatic approach, as they say, seeking truth from facts. And they also mentioned crossing the river, feeling the stones. So it's linked with the ground realities. Thank you, Ambassador, for your insights. And now we move on to Africa, and in Rwanda, Mr. Mbanda Gerald, what is your take? How do you see, from your vantage point in Africa, the significance of this third plenum, and what are its implications?
Thank you for having me. And from the third plenary session, what I see is that, of course, China and Africa have had a very long cooperation that spans for decades. And what was discussed on deepening reforms, it also significantly impacts on the Africa-China cooperation. As we see, for the last 15 years, China has been the largest trading partner with Africa. So as China's economy improves, we also expect benefits within the African countries, because if we are cooperating with China, we are looking at industrial development, we are looking at infrastructure development, For example, the BRI has been very instrumental in improving the way of doing business in Africa because we lack roads to bring, let's say, agricultural products from the farmers to the markets and also to be exported on the international market. So I think, again, if you look at China's development, the third plenary session, when they talk about reform and opening up and then China modernization, the Chinese leaders do not look at China alone, but they look globally to the whole world, how they can work together. If you look at the Global Development Initiative, I think China is the only country that I can hear that talks about Global Development Initiative. Other countries look at China as a threat, you know. The people do not want to share development. Actually, they want to compete. So the Global Development Initiative makes all people share the benefits, and that's where also the sharing, promoting a human community with a shared future. You know, all will have the same destiny. So if we all have economic growth and we all move together, I think this is a very crucial and very important, different from what we see from the Western world.
Thank you, Mr. Gerald. And I will move on to Mr. Perry in London. And basically, we had already discussed how the implications of the third plenary are for the global south. But China is, of course, the world's second largest economy. China is fueling 30% of global economic growth. And China has a very robust relationship with the Western economies, especially the UK and countries in Europe. So from your vantage point in London, Mr. Perry, how do you see the third plenum and its implications for Chinese economic relations with the countries in Europe, especially the UK?
My grandfather was the first Westerner to trade with New China with a letter of credit from Bank of China in 1952 and led a delegation called the Icebreakers in 1953 to sign the first trade agreement with New China and the world. That's opening up. That's the foundation of opening up. What we've seen today is a continuation of what we've heard from someone else today that says clarity. I think if you look at clarity when it comes to China, you can't be surprised because China say what they're going to do. Unlike a lot of countries, China say, this is what we're planning to do. And most of the time, that's what happens. My grandfather told me that China is a very interesting place. It's complex. Its culture is complex. You have to understand the people to understand the business. But it's straightforward because China have the capacity to be able to think 30 years ahead. They have that stability. So we do talk about the dates that are mentioned today in 29 and 35. But you've also got to realize that these are not things that have 5 years to get it done because these have already been work in progress for some time now. I think there's many different aspects of what has come out today that really interest me. I think from a business standpoint, I think what's very interesting and what I implore businesses to focus on is the opening up, the reform in innovation, and you look at the market being lifted. That is hugely beneficial to business around the world. And I think that's what they're looking at because as China now, as you say, is a big boy in the world. It's somewhere where the big person has looked at China and have been worried, and that is America. And where have America attacked China? They've attacked China in technology. And China's focus is in high quality development. And why is that? That's because it's tomorrow's market and it's how tomorrow will be run in business. So their focus has been put towards high quality development and productive forces for a reason. If you look at innovation, you're going into China at the moment and you're looking at areas that you see that it's not happening or is not happening in other countries around the world because the focus has been put on it for 10, 15 years ahead. I think you look at the position in chips and semiconductors that America have put towards China. China, if you stop them, they will continue to develop. So I think there's many different things that's been put forward today. But from a business standpoint, it really interests me that the encouragement of a reshift and a focus that entrepreneurialism done in the right way is encouraged.
Thank you. And moving on to Mr. Victor Gao in Beijing, as we can see from today's third plenum and the discussion we've just had, that President Xi Jinping is a reformer in the tradition of the great Deng Xiaoping. And as the third plenum in 1978 changed the direction and destiny of China and affected the world, I think this third plenum is extremely important in charting out China's direction for the next few decades. And there is a global significance also to today's development, to the development of the in China of the third plenum. So how do you see the significance of the third plenum globally, and especially in the global south? Because the third plenum under Deng Xiaoping had a tremendous international impact also.
I would say Deng Xiaoping not only changed China, but also changed the world. And the third plenum, led by General Secretary Xi Jinping, will further change China for the better, and I would say would also change the world. Why? Because from the Chinese perspective, the world should embrace peace. It's very opposite compared with other countries which sometimes agitate for war. They want to pick a fight, for example. They want to use surrogates or agents to fight a war, and they don't care if human lives are lost, stability is sabotaged, etc. China believes that you cannot achieve development without peace and stability. And peace and stability should not be restricted to one country. It should be widely shared throughout countries, throughout the regions, for example. That's why whenever there is a war, China is always one of the first countries to jump out and call for ceasefire to stop the war. It's the same case for Ukraine. It's the same case for Gaza. China's always loud and clear about the absolute need to stop the war, and through diplomacy and negotiation, achieve ceasefire. Now, this is very important because if you look at the past 46 years for China's huge economic and political transformation, what are the two pillars? One is to preserve peace. The other is to maintain stability, because without domestic stability and without peace in the world, you really cannot achieve your economic goals. So this is the philosophical framework that China has been pushing for domestic policies as well as international policies. And I think this has a bearing on all the other countries in the world, especially in the global south, the developing countries, as we used to say, because we all need to maintain domestic stability. We need to preserve peace. We need to emphasize that development, as Deng Xiaoping said, is the hard truth, because without development, all the others are empty talk. You need to really grow and develop and bring beef and bread onto the table for the people and keep improving their living standards. This is something China has been doing for the past 46 years. If we really put our house in order, if we focus on economic development, if we focus on maintaining peace and stability, for example, and if we refuse to be hijacked by those warmongers, for example, Cold War warriors, and those who emphasize that their values are better than our values, we cannot accept that. We have our values, they have their values. Let them, their God for them, and my God for me, for example. We do not need to impose our ideology onto any other country, but we refuse to be imposed with their ideology or their political system. And I think this will be a better world. And I think this is what exactly President Xi Jinping has emphasized, the shared future of mankind. So allow me to emphasize, let's work together in the same direction to improve our living standards, to make sure that our people in different countries do have the prospect of achieving greater economic growth, accumulating greater wealth, so that our kids will have better lives than our lives, and our generation will be better than our forefathers' generation. The future of the world will be brighter under this roadmap of inclusive global development for all.
Thank you, Mr. Victor Gao. And coming to you, Ambassador Masood Khalid, there is, of course, a very important global significance of what China does, and especially in terms of policy initiatives, including the Third Plenum. And President Xi Jinping 10 years ago launched the Belt and Road Initiative, which is perhaps the most important diplomatic and developmental initiative of the 21st century. And in 10 years span, you've had almost 500,000 jobs generated. You have had 40 million people lifted out of poverty. And we in Pakistan have benefited from the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, which has been important in transforming people's lives in different parts of Pakistan. So given that context, how do you see the significance of the Third Plenum in the big picture, the global setting, and its implications, especially in the global south?
First of all, I would like to make a comment on the outcome of this plenum in terms of the reform process. My impression is, and I think it's very clear from the document, that there is no reversal as far as the reforms are concerned, because today in the document really an all-encompassing reform process has been identified which will be implemented. So this is very important. So the criticism which we hear from time to time from the quarters in the West, that China is not serious in sort of deepening reforms, it's going back on that, on the commitments, etc. I think it is totally false. Secondly, one should give credit to President Xi Jinping. When he came into power in 2012, the GDP of China was about $8 trillion. So by consolidating the reform process, today China is an economy of more than $18 trillion. Very important. So if there was a retardation or a slowdown of the reform process, China would not have achieved this much growth. Yes, there are pressures. United States and some Western countries are squeezing China's space, in terms of restrictions on technology transfers, exports, this and that. So we know that. But China is determined to follow its path. Now, coming to and another thing I want to say in that context, there was another criticism which I saw, that China is marginalizing its private sector. Now, that is not the case. Private sector plays a very vital role in China's economy. And today in the document, there is a very clear formulation that the Chinese government will support the public sector as well as the non-public sector, the private sector. So there will be a synergy in pursuing the national objectives of development, national development. Now, coming to BRI, not only what China has achieved in the last 45 years or so in terms of lifting 800 million people out of poverty, but now China is in a position to share the fruits of its development with poor countries, developing countries. And now, as far as Pakistan is concerned, of course, we are thankful to China for coming forward in helping us in overcoming this development deficit which had existed for several years through CPEC. CPEC has made good progress. There have been local employment generation, there have been infrastructure development, and we are moving ahead into this, entering into second phase.
Thank you very much. And now I move on to Africa, and Mr. Mbanda, Gerald, we talked about the global impact. I'd like to ask you about African countries. And you mentioned China being a game changer for African countries. How can African countries learn from and adapt to some of the Chinese reform strategies in economic development, which have been so beneficial for the Chinese people, and which, if adapted in the conditions of Africa can also be equally beneficial for African economies. Your take on it?
I think there is a lot that Africa can learn from China. I have written a book about China and my country, Rwanda. And I talked about how effective leadership is key to transformational governance. So in China, we see that the governance led by President Xi Jinping is really effective and transformational. And that's why we see this rapid development that is taking place. In Africa, most of the problem that we have is failure in governance. This is a fact that we have a problem in governance, but China can be a good example. If we borrow a leaf from China's governance, I think we can be able to make strides and improve. Secondly, also, we can look at planning and policy implementation. Sometimes we do planning, but policy implementation becomes a problem. So in China, when you look at these goals that are being set the other year, actually most of these goals are realized. So the policy implementation, still, if we can be able to improve on policy implementation, we don't just keep it in papers. I think China would be a very good learning experience. Now, recently, in the past years, China was able to eliminate abject poverty. When you look at most of our countries in the African continent, this is a very big problem that still affects most of our countries. So we can ask ourselves, how did China do it? If in the 1960s, some of African countries were richer than China, so what has happened within a span of 46 years? So this, again, takes back to things like governance, things like fight against corruption. I think these are good examples that we can borrow from China's development, and we are able to move forward. Again, there is something very interesting. When you talk about whole process people's democracy, this is a democracy where people are involved, right from the grassroots up to the top level. So this again makes people become owners of the governance system. So sometimes you find that people are left out, and yet what the government is doing for the people. So people must be involved at all processes. And probably lastly, putting people first, because whatever the development the country is doing, it is doing it in the interest of the people. It is doing it to improve on their lives so that they can have a good life. So I think these are things that I can say if we can be able to borrow from the Chinese example, I think Africa, we can also be able to do better and move on.
Thank you. And I think your point is quite well taken, that any kind of adaptation or learning or borrowing from the outside world, especially China, has to be done in the local context where it should be adapted to the local conditions and the ground realities. And I think that is the key thing. Learning means that being inspired by a certain model and then seeing its applicability in the local conditions of respective countries. Thank you, Mr. Gerald. I think we had a great discussion, a riveting discussion, if I may, from the experiences of our four distinguished panelists from different parts of the world with different backgrounds. And I think let's discuss some of the, in conclusion, some of the key takeaways from the third plenum of the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. It's very clear that China has entered a new era under President Xi Jinping. Reform is the hallmark of this new era. And President Xi Jinping is the helmsman of reform, spearheading China's development, modernization and reform in the 21st century. And this is a process which did not start recently. It started from day one. In 2012, when he became General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, his first visit was to Shenzhen, where the reform process started. And what did he say there? He said that reform will not stop and opening up will not cease. And then he paid homage to Deng Xiaoping because his statue was there. He laid a floral wreath there. And this reform has been multifaceted, multidimensional. It has been evident in globalization. It has been evident in the green revolution, especially now in electric vehicles. It has been evident also in the ratings of the global innovation index world over. It's been evident in the fact that from an 8 trillion economy when he took over as the General Secretary 10 years ago, it's now an 18 trillion economy. So it has expanded and it has been focused on, like Deng Xiaoping, on the well-being of the people, that reform should benefit the people. And then he's ensured that it is also a shared prosperity, that reform is not just confined to China, and the fruits of reform and development and modernization are shared. And that's why you have the Belt and Road Initiative, you have the Global Development Initiative, you have the Global Security Initiative, you have the Global Civilization Initiative. With this, we come to an end to this episode of Global South Voices, which is the special program of CGTN, reflecting the worldview through the lenses of the Global South, the world's majority. And you can also find us in CGTN app, in X, in Facebook, and YouTube. And till our next episode, we wish you goodbye and thank you for viewing this program.